The gavel crashed down with a sound like fate itself. The courtroom fell silent as Judge Richard Hampton's voice, cold and resolute, pronounced the words that would echo through the small town of Pinewood for years to come. Alexander Morgan, this court finds you guilty of the first-degree murder of Sarah Williams. You are hereby sentenced to death by lethal injection, to be carried out within 48 hours. Alex stood motionless, his weathered face betraying no emotion. The former police detective, once respected throughout Pinewood, now stood condemned as a monster. The evidence had been overwhelming: threatening text messages to Sarah, his gun found near her charred remains, witnesses placing him in the forest that fateful night. The jury had deliberated for just 3 hours. Behind him, the gallery erupted, some in tears, others in vengeful satisfaction. Robert Williams, Sarah's father, nodded grimly, justice for his daughter finally within reach. But across the aisle, Sarah's mother, Margaret, covered her mouth, shaking her head in silent protest. "Does the condemned wish to make a statement?" Judge Hampton asked, his voice cutting through the commotion. Alex raised his eyes, meeting the judge's gaze with unexpected clarity. "I have only one request," he said, his voice steady despite everything. "I wish to see my dog, Caesar, one last time." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Some laughed bitterly. Was this the best a murderer could ask for in his final hours? The dog. But those who knew Alex Morgan from before understood. Caesar wasn't just a pet. The aging German Shepherd had been his partner, his confidant, his last connection to a life that now seemed to belong to someone else entirely. The judge hesitated, then nodded. "Request granted. You will be permitted to see your dog before the sentence is carried out." What no one in that courtroom could possibly know was that this simple request, this final meeting between a condemned man and his faithful companion, would set in motion a chain of events that would shake the foundations of everything they believed to be true. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Alex Morgan had never imagined his life would end this way. At 48, the former detective's body bore the scars of 23 years in law enforcement: a bullet wound in his left shoulder, knife marks across his abdomen, and a permanent limp from a suspect who'd pushed him down 3 flights of stairs. But the deepest scars were invisible, etched into his soul by the memories of those he couldn't save. His small cabin on the outskirts of Pinewood offered the solitude he craved after retirement. Nestled against Pinewood Forest, with its towering pines and dense undergrowth, the property was exactly what he needed: space for Caesar to run, distance from prying eyes, and silence to drown out the echoes of his past. The German Shepherd had been at his side for 10 years now, ever since that terrible night when Alex's partner, James Williams, had been gunned down during a drug raid gone wrong. Caesar, then a young police dog, had been severely wounded trying to protect James. Alex had carried the bleeding animal to safety, and when the department suggested euthanizing the injured dog, Alex had instead taken him home. They had healed together, man and dog, 2 survivors bound by shared trauma and unspoken understanding. Caesar's loyalty never wavered, even as the nightmares plagued Alex and the whiskey bottles piled up during those first dark years. Sarah Williams had entered his life like an unexpected ray of sunlight. James's younger sister had tracked Alex down 5 years after her brother's death, seeking closure. At 32, she possessed the same determined gaze as her brother, the same unflinching courage. What began as awkward conversations over coffee gradually evolved into something neither had anticipated. For a time, Alex believed he might have found a second chance at happiness. But happiness wasn't in the cards for men like Alex Morgan. Not in Pinewood, where the past had a way of resurfacing just when you thought it was safely buried. Judge Richard Hampton had presided over Pinewood's court for nearly 30 years. Known for his uncompromising stance on violent crime, the 65-year-old jurist had sent more men to death row than any other judge in the state. Rumor had it he kept a tally in a leather-bound notebook. The trial had been a spectacle from the start. District Attorney Victoria Palmer, ambitious and meticulously prepared, had presented a case so tight it seemed impenetrable. Only James Foster, Alex's court-appointed attorney, a tired man of 68 counting the days until retirement, had seemed to notice the inconsistencies, the convenient timing, with the evidence that fit together almost too perfectly. The first time Sarah Williams walked into Alex's life, he'd almost mistaken her for a ghost. She had her brother's eyes, the same determined hazel that had stared back at Alex from across police cruisers for 7 years of partnership. She'd found him at O'Malley's bar, nursing a whiskey on the anniversary of James's death. "You're Alex Morgan," she'd said, sliding onto the stool beside him. No question in her voice, just certainty. "I'm Sarah Williams. James was my brother." Alex had nodded, unable to speak past the sudden tightness in his throat. He'd avoided the Williams family after the funeral, couldn't bear to see the accusation in their eyes, the unspoken question, "Why did you live when he died?" But Sarah hadn't accused. She'd ordered a whiskey of her own, raised it in a silent toast, and then asked about her brother. Not how he died, she knew that story too well, but how he lived. The stories no one had told her, the man he was when wearing the badge. That night had stretched into dawn, memories and tears and even occasional laughter flowing as freely as the alcohol. When they finally parted, the weight on Alex's shoulders felt somehow lighter. He'd expected never to see her again, this ghost sister who had granted him a measure of absolution. But a week later she was on his porch, a bottle of decent bourbon in hand and more questions in her eyes. What neither of them could have anticipated was how quickly those meetings would evolve into something deeper. Sarah's sharp wit and unflinching honesty cut through Alex's defenses like they were tissue paper. For the first time since James died, Alex found himself looking forward to tomorrow. 8 months ago, everything changed. Sarah started receiving phone calls that would send her hurrying outside, her voice dropping to whispers. She canceled plans last minute, offered vague explanations about work emergencies, though her job at the local community college rarely demanded such urgency. When Alex questioned her, she grew defensive. "Not everything in my life is your business, Alex," she'd snapped one night after he'd pressed too hard. "I don't interrogate you about every minute of your day." The distance between them grew. Sarah's absences became more frequent, her explanations more implausible. Alex, trained to spot lies through decades of police work, recognized the signs but couldn't bring himself to confront what they might mean. Was she seeing someone else? Had she finally grown tired of his damaged soul, his nightmares, his silences? What Alex couldn't know was that Sarah Williams had followed in her brother's footsteps in ways no one suspected. 3 years earlier, she had been recruited by the State Bureau of Investigation to work undercover. Her position at the community college provided perfect cover as she gathered intelligence on the Eight Spokes, a motorcycle gang that had transformed Pinewood County into the methamphetamine capital of the state. The Eight Spokes weren't just drug dealers. Their leader, Victor Reed, had expanded into human trafficking, bringing young women from across the border with promises of jobs, then trapping them in a nightmare of addiction and prostitution. Sarah had worked her way into their periphery, dating a lower-ranking member, gathering evidence piece by painstaking piece. Alex had stumbled onto the truth accidentally. He'd found a burner phone in Sarah's jacket pocket while hanging it up one evening. The text message visible on the screen had made his blood run cold. "Meeting confirmed. Reed expects product delivery Friday. Delete after reading." When confronted, Sarah had been furious, not at being discovered, but at the risk to her operation. "You've been a cop, Alex. You know how this works. If you compromise me, people will die. Not just me." The argument that followed was explosive. Alex, terrified for her safety, demanded she pull out. Sarah, committed to finishing what she'd started, refused. The text messages they exchanged in the days after would later be read in court, stripped of context and twisted into evidence of obsession and threat. "This has to end, Sarah. I can't watch you do this. You don't control me. I'll finish what I started. If you continue, everything will fall apart. There will be no coming back." "Is that a threat, Alex?" "It's the truth. This ends one way if you keep going." 3 days after that exchange, Sarah disappeared. Alex, frantic, searched everywhere he could think of. He tramped through the woods near the abandoned quarry where the Eight Spokes were rumored to meet, looking for any sign of her. He called in old favors from former colleagues, but no one had seen her. It was as if Sarah Williams had simply vanished. 8 days later, a hiker found her body in a clearing 2 miles into Pinewood Forest. She had been burned beyond recognition, identified only through dental records. The medical examiner determined she had been alive when the fire started. When police searched the area, they found Alex's hunting rifle hidden beneath fallen leaves 50 yards from the body. The trial of Alexander Morgan versus the state began on a Monday morning in early October. Overnight, Pinewood transformed from a quiet mountain town to the epicenter of a media circus. News vans clogged Main Street, reporters ambushed locals for insider perspectives. And the diner across from the courthouse doubled its prices for coffee and renamed its breakfast special The Guilty Verdict. Inside the century-old courthouse, the gallery divided like the Red Sea. On one side sat those convinced of Alex's guilt, led by Robert Williams, Sarah's father, his face etched with grief hardened to hatred. On the other, a smaller contingent who couldn't reconcile the Alex Morgan they knew with the monster described in the indictment. Caesar had been relegated to the care of Alex's elderly neighbor, Mrs. Peterson, who reported that the German shepherd barely ate and spent his days staring down the road toward town. District Attorney Victoria Palmer built her case methodically, a masterclass in prosecutorial precision. She painted Alex as a man obsessed, a former cop whose relationship with his dead partner's sister had soured into something possessive and ultimately deadly. The evidence, ladies and gentlemen, she told the jury in her opening statement, will show that when Sarah Williams attempted to break free from the defendant's controlling grip, he responded as too many men do, with lethal violence. For the threatening text messages, the hunting rifle registered to Alex found near the crime scene, soil matching Alex's property on his boots, witnesses who placed him near the forest the day Sarah disappeared. And most damning, the absence of alibi. Alex had been alone that entire weekend, with only Caesar to vouch for his whereabouts. James Foster, Alex's court-appointed defense attorney, fought admirably despite the overwhelming odds. His hands trembled slightly from arthritis as he shuffled his papers, but his mind remained razor-sharp. He highlighted the circumstantial nature of the evidence, the lack of motive, the spotless record of a man who had served his community for decades. If Alex Morgan wanted to commit murder, Foster challenged during cross-examination of the ballistics expert, why would he use his own registered weapon? Why would a decorated detective with 23 years of experience in solving homicides leave such an obvious trail? But for every point Foster scored, Palmer landed 3 more. The prosecution's case seemed airtight. On the 3rd day of trial, the courthouse erupted in chaos when Margaret Williams, Sarah's mother and Robert's ex-wife, entered and seated herself deliberately on Alex's side of the gallery. Robert lunged across the aisle, shouting obscenities at his former wife. "Traitor," he screamed as bailiffs restrained him. "Our daughter is dead, and you side with her killer." Margaret remained eerily composed, her eyes fixed forward. "I know my daughter," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "And I know Alex Morgan. This isn't right." Judge Hampton ordered Robert Williams removed from the courtroom and threatened to close proceedings to the public if such outbursts continued. The incident made the evening news across the state, further inflaming tensions in Pinewood. At night, someone threw a brick through Mrs. Peterson's window with a note attached, "Dog of a murderer deserves a murderer's fate." Throughout the proceedings, Alex remained stone-faced. He answered questions when directed, his voice flat and emotionless. Only Foster knew the real reason for Alex's seeming indifference. He was protecting Sarah's undercover work even now. The ongoing investigation into the 8 spokes had not concluded with her death. The other agents remained embedded, their lives hanging in the balance. "Tell them the truth," Foster had urged in the privacy of the consultation room. "It's your only chance." Alex had shaken his head. "If I expose her, I expose others. More people will die. Sarah would never forgive me." "Sarah is dead," Foster had countered, frustration evident in his voice. "And you will be too if you don't give me something to work with." The turning point came on the 7th day when Detective Michael Harris took the stand. As the lead investigator on the case, his testimony carried significant weight. Harris described discovering the hidden rifle, the threatening messages on Sarah's phone, the timeline he'd constructed placing Alex at the scene during the window of Sarah's murder. Foster's cross-examination began benignly enough, establishing Harris's experience and relationship with Alex during their overlapping years on the force. Then, almost casually, he asked, "Detective Harris, have you ever had contact with members of the Eight Spokes Motorcycle Club?" Palmer was on her feet before Harris could answer. Her objection. "Relevance? Your Honor," Foster countered, "I'm establishing potential bias in the investigation." Judge Hampton frowned. "I'll allow it, but counsel is on a short leash." "Answer the question, Detective." Harris shifted in his seat. "In my capacity as a narcotics investigator, I've had professional contact with various criminal organizations." "Including the Eight Spokes?" "Yes, including them." Foster nodded, then produced a bank statement. "Would you explain this deposit of $25,000 to your offshore account 3 days after Sarah Williams's body was discovered?" The courtroom erupted. Palmer objected vehemently, Harris's face drained of color, and Judge Hampton furiously called for order. The jury was dismissed while the judge examined Foster's evidence in chambers. When court reconvened, Hampton's expression was thunderous. "This document will not be admitted. Counsel is admonished for ambushing a witness without proper discovery." The damage, however, was done. A seed of doubt had been planted. Jurors exchanged glances, and for the first time Palmer looked rattled. But it wasn't enough. After closing arguments, the jury retired to deliberate, returning after just 3 hours, a bad sign for any defendant. The foreman, a retired schoolteacher, couldn't meet Alex's eyes as she delivered the verdict, guilty on all counts. 2 days later, Judge Hampton delivered his sentence with the grim finality of a man who believed justice was being served. Death by lethal injection, to be carried out within 48 hours, an unusually expedited timeline explained by citing the heinous nature of the crime and the defendant's potential danger to society. As Alex was led from the courtroom in chains, he spotted Margaret Williams. Their eyes met briefly, and in that moment, something passed between them, a shared understanding that the truth remained buried and time was running out to unearth it. The death row cell at Pinewood County Detention Center was Spartan by design, a concrete box with a narrow bed bolted to the floor, a stainless steel toilet without a seat, and a small desk with a fixed stool, and a single window, too narrow for a man to squeeze through, even if the reinforced glass could somehow be broken, offered a sliver of gray October sky. Alex sat on the edge of the bed, his prison uniform loose around his frame. He'd lost weight during the trial, his already lean body now bordering on gaunt. When the heavy door creaked open, he didn't immediately look up. He expected another guard, another chaplain, another official with paperwork for him to sign. Instead, he heard the familiar click of nails on concrete, a sound that had accompanied him for a decade of his life. "Caesar," he whispered, finally raising his eyes. The German shepherd stood in the doorway, ears perked forward, body trembling with the effort of restraining himself. Behind him, Warden Franklin Porter nodded to the guard. "You have 30 minutes, Morgan. Special permission from Judge Hampton. The dog's been checked for contraband." Alex nodded his thanks, not trusting himself to speak. As soon as the guard removed Caesar's leash, the dog bounded forward, nearly knocking Alex backward onto the bed in his enthusiasm. Caesar's whines of joy filled the small space as he licked Alex's face, his body wiggling with unrestrained happiness. For the first time since his arrest, Alex felt tears burning behind his eyes. "Hey, boy," he murmured, burying his face in the dog's thick fur. "I've missed you." The guard stepped outside, closing the door but remaining visible through the small window. Alex knew they were being watched, possibly recorded, but in this moment it didn't matter. He had Caesar in his arms again, his oldest friend, the one living being who had never questioned his innocence. Mrs. Peterson had done her best with Caesar, but the dog looked thinner, his coat less lustrous. The separation had taken its toll on both of them. Alex ran his hands over Caesar, checking for any signs of injury or illness, an old habit from their days working together. When his fingers found a small, partially healed cut on Caesar's right flank, he frowned. "What happened here, boy?" he whispered, but Caesar only whined and pressed closer. For several minutes Alex simply held his dog, drawing comfort from the familiar weight and warmth. Then, keeping his voice low and his lips close to Caesar's ear, he began to speak urgently. "Listen to me, Caesar, this is important." The dog stilled, sensing the change in his master's tone. "I need you to find Sarah's evidence. Remember the old hunting cabin where we found those drifters last winter? There's something there that can help me. Find it, Caesar. Find it and bring it to someone who can help." Alex knew it was a desperate gamble. Caesar was a highly trained former police dog, capable of tracking and retrieving it, but what Alex was asking required a level of understanding beyond even the most intelligent animal's capabilities. Yet he had no other options. No one believed him except Margaret Williams, and she had no power to help. His appeals would take years, and he had less than 2 days. As Alex continued to whisper to Caesar, the dog's ears twitched back and forth, his brown eyes fixed intently on his master's face. Anyone observing would see nothing unusual, just a condemned man saying goodbye to his beloved pet. But between man and dog passed a decade of trust, of shared work, of an unspoken bond that transcended normal communication. When the guard announced that time was up, Alex gave Caesar one final embrace. "Go to Margaret Williams," he whispered. "She'll understand." Caesar resisted when the guard attached the leash, looking back at Alex with what seemed like determination in his eyes. As the door closed between them, Alex allowed himself a moment of hope, his last remaining lifeline in a world that had already condemned him. 2 hours later, as Margaret Williams drove Caesar back to Mrs. Peterson's house, she was startled when the German Shepherd suddenly lunged against his seatbelt harness, barking urgently. They were passing the old logging road that led deep into Pinewood Forest, miles from town. "What is it, boy?" she asked, slowing the car. Caesar's barking intensified, and when Margaret pulled to the side of the road, he scrabbled at the door handle. Something in his desperation gave her pause. She'd grown up with dogs, understood their ways. Caesar wasn't just excited or anxious, he was trying to communicate something specific. Making a split-second decision, Margaret unhooked Caesar's harness. The moment she opened the door, he bolted into the trees, then stopped, looking back at her expectantly. "You want me to follow you?" she asked incredulously. Caesar barked once, then turned and continued into the forest, pausing occasionally to ensure she was still behind him. Margaret hesitated only briefly before grabbing her phone and the flashlight she kept in her glove compartment. Something told her this wasn't a coincidence, that somehow Alex had communicated with the dog. It sounded crazy, but no crazier than believing her daughter's former lover had murdered her in cold blood. "Lead on, Caesar," she said, and followed the dog into the gathering dusk. Meanwhile, in his cell, Alex Morgan stared at the ceiling, mentally counting down the hours. 42 hours until they would strap him to a gurney and administer the cocktail of drugs that would stop his heart. 42 hours to somehow clear his name and find Sarah's real killers. He had played his last card, entrusting his fate to a dog. Even to his own ears, it sounded like the desperate fantasy of a doomed man. His thoughts drifted to Sarah, not as she must have been in her final moments, but as she had been that first night at O'Malley's bar, her eyes bright with unshed tears as she asked about her brother. Had she already been working undercover then? Had their entire relationship been part of her cover? He didn't want to believe it, but the question had haunted him since discovering her secret life. The truth was, it didn't matter. Whatever her initial motives, what had grown between them had been real. He'd seen it in her eyes that last night when she'd slipped out of his bed at dawn, kissing him softly before leaving. "I'll be careful," she'd promised. "I always am." But careful hadn't been enough. The 8 spokes had somehow discovered her true identity. Alex had pieced together enough to know that Sarah had been investigating a trafficking operation, but that young women were being brought across state lines and held in remote locations around Pinewood County. One of those locations must have been near his property. It was the only explanation for why his rifle had been found near her body. The killers had deliberately framed him, perhaps knowing about his relationship with Sarah, perhaps simply taking advantage of a convenient scapegoat. If only Caesar could somehow find the proof led Margaret to something concrete, but it was a fool's hope. Alex closed his eyes, finally allowing the tears to fall in the privacy of his cell. Across town, James Foster sat in his small law office surrounded by stacks of case files. At 68, he should have been enjoying retirement, spending his days fishing at Pinewood Lake or visiting his grandchildren in Colorado. Instead, he was poring over every detail of the Morgan case, searching for any avenue of appeal, any procedural error that might win a stay of execution. The truth was, Foster didn't believe Alex Morgan was guilty. 40 years as a defense attorney had given him a finely tuned instinct for guilt versus innocence, regardless of the evidence. But instinct wouldn't save Alex Morgan from lethal injection. Foster rubbed his tired eyes, then reached for the bottle of antacids he kept in his desk drawer. His ulcer had flared badly during the trial, and now it burned like a coal in his stomach. As he swallowed 2 tablets dry, his phone buzzed with an incoming text. Unknown number. Check Detective Harris's bank records for the past year. Monthly deposits. Source, 8 Spokes Treasurer. Proof in locker 328, Pinewood Bus Terminal. Foster stared at the message, his heart suddenly pounding. Was this a cruel prank, or the break they desperately needed? His fingers hovered over the phone, debating whether to respond. Before he could decide, a second message arrived. Unknown number, key under plant pot left of entrance. Hurry. He grabbed his coat and car keys, decision made. Even the slimmest chance was better than sitting here waiting for Alex Morgan to die. Deep in Pinewood Forest, Caesar led Margaret Williams with unerring certainty. The German shepherd navigated the growing darkness as if following an invisible trail, never hesitating at forks in the path, never slowing his determined pace. Margaret struggled to keep up, her city shoes ill-suited for the rough terrain. Twice she nearly turned back, convinced this was nothing but an old dog's confusion. But each time Caesar would stop and wait for her, his eyes somehow conveying an urgency she couldn't ignore. After nearly an hour of hiking, they reached a small clearing. In the center stood a dilapidated hunting cabin, its windows boarded, its door hanging askew on rusted hinges. Caesar barked once, then darted toward the cabin. "Is this it?" Margaret asked, shining her flashlight on the crumbling structure. "What are we looking for, boy?" The cabin's interior was thick with dust and cobwebs. The beam of Margaret's flashlight revealed a collapsed table, a rusted wood stove, and animal droppings scattered across the warped wooden floor. Caesar moved with purpose toward the back wall, where a threadbare rug lay half-curled beside the remains of a bed frame. The dog pawed at the rug, whining insistently. Margaret moved the rug aside, revealing a loose floorboard. "Good boy," she whispered, her hands trembling as she worked the board free. Beneath it was a small cavity, and inside a plastic bag containing what appeared to be a smartphone and a small black notebook. "Oh my God," Margaret breathed. "Sarah's handwriting." Caesar sat back on his haunches, watching as Margaret quickly photographed everything with her phone before replacing the items exactly as they'd found them. She slipped the notebook into her pocket, but left the phone evidence should remain undisturbed for the authorities, and the notebook would provide insurance if anything disappeared during the investigation. "We need to get this to Foster," she told Caesar, who was already heading for the door, his mission accomplished. As they made their way back through the darkening forest, neither noticed the figure watching from deeper in the trees, nor heard the soft crackle of a radio as a message was delivered. They found it. Take care of it now. In his cell, Alex Morgan jerked awake from a fitful sleep. Something had changed in the atmosphere of the prison. The usual night sounds were punctuated by urgent footsteps, raised voices. He sat up, straining to hear. He found something, lawyer demanding. Hampton won't issue a stay based on. T. Williams' woman claiming. Alex's heart rate doubled. Had Caesar succeeded? Had Margaret found something? He moved to the door, trying to catch more of the conversation, but the voices had moved out of range. The minutes crawled by, each one a lifetime of hope and dread combined. Finally, his cell door opened. Warden Porter stood there, his expression unreadable. "Your attorney's here, Morgan. You've got 15 minutes." Foster looked like he'd aged a decade since the sentencing. His suit was rumpled, his tie loosened, and a thin sheen of sweat covered his forehead despite the October chill. "They're trying to rush this through," he said without preamble. Margaret Williams found a notebook in an old hunting cabin, Sarah's notebook. "It names names, Alex. Big names. Detective Harris, Judge Hampton's son-in-law, even the mayor's brother. All connected to the 8 spokes, all involved in the trafficking operation." Alex felt dizzy with the implications. And Sarah had proof? Dates, locations, bank account numbers. She was building a RICO case that would have brought down half the power structure in this county. Foster lowered his voice. "I've filed for an emergency stay of execution, but Hampton is fighting it. Claims the notebook could be a forgery, that there's no chain of custody, that it's all too convenient." "It's not enough," Alex realized, his brief hope crumbling. "Not yet," Foster agreed grimly. "But it's a start. I've got a court clerk checking Harris's financial records based on an anonymous tip. And the state attorney general's office is sending investigators first thing tomorrow. We just need time, Alex." Crime was the one thing he didn't have. 36 hours until execution. "What about Caesar?" Alex asked. "Is he safe?" A shadow crossed Foster's face. "Margaret left him with her ex-husband while she brought me the notebook. Robert may hate you, but he loves dogs. Always has, according to Margaret." What Foster didn't tell Alex was the rest: that Caesar had been limping badly by the time they'd returned to the road, that a closer examination had revealed a wound in the dog's side that hadn't been there before, that looked suspiciously like a bullet graze. Someone had tried to stop them in the forest, had fired at the dog but missed a killing shot. Margaret had taken Caesar to an emergency vet before bringing the notebook to Foster, and the animal was now sedated, his condition serious but stable. "We're going to fight this with everything we've got," Foster promised, gripping Alex's arm. "Don't give up." After Foster left, Alex returned to his bunk, mind racing. Sarah's notebook might not be enough to save him, but it confirmed what he'd suspected all along: her death wasn't random, and his framing had been deliberate. Someone had wanted him out of the way, someone who knew about his relationship with Sarah and feared what she might have told him. Outside, the first snowflakes of the season began to fall, dusting Pinewood with a deceptive purity. In his mansion on the hill, Judge Richard Hampton stared at his phone, reading and rereading the text message from his son-in-law: "Problem with the Williams woman. She found something. Foster is pushing for a stay." Hampton deleted the message, then dialed a number he'd sworn never to use. "It's me," he said when the call connected. "We need to clean this up. Now." The snowfall intensified through the night, blanketing Pinewood in 6 inches of pristine white by dawn. Schools announced closures, plows rumbled down Main Street, and the courthouse steps disappeared under drifts that the custodial staff battled with shovels and salt. Inside the stately building, an emergency hearing was underway in Judge Hampton's chambers, away from the press and public scrutiny. James Foster stood his ground, Sarah's notebook open on the judge's desk. "This is exculpatory evidence that was unavailable during trial, Your Honor. At minimum, it warrants a stay of execution pending further investigation." District Attorney Victoria Palmer remained composed, though her eyes betrayed her anxiety. "A notebook of unknown provenance, conveniently discovered hours before a scheduled execution? The defense's desperation is palpable and, frankly, embarrassing." Judge Hampton leaned back in his leather chair, fingers steepled beneath his chin. To anyone observing, he appeared to be weighing the arguments with judicial impartiality. Only he knew the hammering of his heart, the cold sweat dampening his shirt beneath his robes. The notebook before him contained his son-in-law's name, connected to bank transfers linked to the 8 spokes. If authenticated, it would destroy not just Hampton's family, but his legacy. "Mr. Foster," Hampton said finally, "while I appreciate your zealous advocacy for your client, I find this evidence insufficient to justify a stay. The notebook contains unsubstantiated allegations that may have been written by anyone, at any time. The chain of custody is compromised. and the manner of its discovery by the victim's mother following the guidance of a dog no less strains credulity. Foster's face flushed with anger. With all due respect, Your Honor, you're making a grave mistake. The State Attorney General's office is sending investigators who will arrive after the scheduled execution, Hampton interrupted. If they find compelling evidence, the governor can always issue a posthumous pardon. Motion denied. As Foster gathered his materials, hands shaking with a combination of rage and disappointment, Palmer avoided his gaze. Something in the prosecutor's demeanor had shifted, a flicker of doubt, perhaps, or the first stirrings of conscience. Hampton noticed it too. "Ms. Palmer, a moment, please," he said as Foster departed. When they were alone, Hampton fixed her with a cold stare. "You've built an impressive career, Victoria. It would be unfortunate to see it derailed by 11th-hour theatrics from a desperate defense attorney." The threat wasn't subtle. Palmer nodded stiffly. "The people are satisfied with the verdict and sentence, Your Honor." "Good," Hampton replied. "See that it stays that way." Across town at Pinewood Veterinary Clinic, Margaret Williams sat beside Caesar's cage, her hand resting gently on the sedated dog's head. The bullet graze on his flank had been cleaned and stitched, and the veterinarian assured her he would recover fully. But time was running out. Foster's text had been brief but devastating. Stay denied. Execution proceeds as scheduled. 24 hours remaining. "What else can you show us, Caesar?" she whispered. "What else did Sarah leave behind?" The German shepherd's eyes opened briefly at the sound of her voice, a low whine escaping his throat. Despite his injury and sedation, he seemed restless, eager to continue his mission. Margaret stroked his fur, considering their options. The notebook hadn't been enough. They needed the phone, or something else Sarah might have hidden. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Robert Williams stood awkwardly in the doorway, his tall frame hunched as if bearing an invisible weight. In the months since Sarah's death, her father had aged decades, grief etching deep lines in his once handsome face. "How is he?" Robert asked, gesturing toward Caesar. "Recovering. The bullet just grazed him, thankfully." Margaret studied her ex-husband, noting the dark circles under his eyes. "You haven't slept." Robert entered the room slowly, as if unsure of his welcome. "I've been thinking about what you said. About the notebook. About Alex." He dragged a hand across his face. "What if we've been wrong, Maggie? What if he didn't kill our little girl?" The use of her old nickname, Maggie, after so many years broke something open inside Margaret. Tears filled her eyes. "I've been trying to tell you. Sarah was investigating something big, something dangerous. The notebook proves it. Alex was framed." Robert sank into the chair opposite her, Caesar's cage between them like neutral territory in their long Cold War. "I was so angry," he whispered. "I needed someone to blame." It was easier to point at Alex than to think about Sarah putting herself in danger, following in James's footsteps. "She was brave," Margaret said. "Like her father, like her brother." For a moment they sat in silence, united in their grief and newfound uncertainty. Then Caesar stirred, lifting his head and fixing Robert with an intense stare. The dog struggled to his feet, swaying slightly. "He should rest," Margaret said, reaching for him, but Caesar evaded her grasp. He limped to Robert, pawed at his jacket, then looked toward the door. "What is it, boy?" Robert asked, suddenly alert. "What are you trying to tell us?" Caesar barked once, then moved determinedly toward the door, looking back at them expectantly. "He wants us to follow him again," Margaret realized. "There's more." Robert hesitated only briefly. "Let's go." Meanwhile, at the Pinewood bus terminal, Detective Michael Harris unlocked locker 328 with a key he'd retrieved from under a planter. Inside was a manila envelope, thick with documents. Harris glanced around nervously before removing it, tucking it inside his jacket. The text he'd received had been clear: destroy everything in the locker, silence anyone who might have seen the contents. What he hadn't expected was to find James Foster waiting in the parking lot, leaning against Harris's unmarked police car. "A bit early for a bus trip, isn't it, Detective?" Foster called, his voice carrying in the crisp morning air. Harris froze, one hand instinctively moving toward his service weapon. "What are you doing here, Foster?" "Funny thing about anonymous tips," Foster replied, straightening up. "Sometimes they come with insurance policies, like sending the same information to multiple parties." He held up his phone, displaying a photo of the locker key. "I've been waiting to see who would collect the evidence. Didn't expect it to be the lead detective on a capital murder case." Harris's expression hardened. "You're interfering with an ongoing investigation." "Am I?" Foster took a step closer. "Or am I witnessing obstruction of justice?" "What's in the envelope, Michael?" "Bank records." "Photos? The missing pieces that prove Alex Morgan was framed?" For a moment Harris seemed to waver, conflict evident in his face. Then his features settled into grim resignation. "You have no idea what you're getting involved in, old man. This goes way beyond Morgan, way beyond Sarah Williams. Walk away while you still can." Foster shook his head. "I've spent 40 years defending the guilty, Michael. It's about time I saved someone who's innocent." The standoff might have continued indefinitely if not for the arrival of a third-party estate police cruiser pulling into the parking lot with lights flashing. 2 officers emerged, approaching with measured caution. "James Foster?" one called. "We've been looking for you. State Attorney General's office sent us to secure evidence related to the Morgan case." Harris's hand moved from his gun to his badge, but Foster spoke first. "Officers, I believe Detective Harris is in possession of evidence relevant to your investigation." An envelope from locker 328, currently inside his jacket. All eyes turned to Harris, whose face had gone pale. The detective's mind raced through options, calculations, potential scenarios, but each ended with the same conclusion. The web of protection that had shielded the 8 spokes for years was unraveling, and he stood exposed at its center. In that moment of realization, Harris made his choice. In one fluid motion, he drew his weapon not to fire, but to buy time. "Stay back," he shouted, backing toward his car. "This isn't what it looks like." "Put the gun down, Detective," one state officer commanded, drawing his own weapon. "Don't make this worse than it already is." Harris reached his car door, fumbling with the handle while keeping his gun trained on the officers. "You don't understand. They'll kill me if this gets out." "They'll kill my family." "Or who will?" Foster pressed, sensing a crucial moment. "The 8 spokes? Judge Hampton? Tell us, Michael. It's your only way out now." Something broke in Harris's expression, fear giving way to desperation, then to a terrible clarity. "It's all connected," he said, his voice suddenly calm. "The trafficking, the drugs, the judges, the politicians. Sarah Williams figured it out. She had proof." He patted the envelope inside his jacket. "She had all of this, and they killed her for it." "And Alex Morgan?" Foster asked. "Did you frame him?" Harris's laugh was hollow. It was convenient. He had a connection to Sarah. He lived near the kill site, and he was just unstable enough to be believable. The perfect patsy. One of the state officers stepped forward cautiously. "We can protect you and your family, Detective, but you need to surrender now." For a brief moment it seemed Harris might comply. Then his expression hardened again. "No one can protect us from them." In a swift motion he opened his car door and slid behind the wheel. "Harris," Foster shouted, but the detective had already started the engine. The car peeled backward, then forward, tires spraying slush as it fishtailed toward the exit. The state officers rushed to their cruiser, calling for backup as they gave chase. Foster stood alone in the parking lot, snow falling around him, wondering if he'd just witnessed their best chance at saving Alex Morgan drive away in terror. What Foster couldn't know was that, at that exact moment, Caesar was leading Margaret and Robert Williams to an abandoned well house deep in Pinewood Forest. The small stone structure had once supplied water to the hunting cabin, but had fallen into disuse decades ago. Inside, hidden beneath a loose stone in the floor, Sarah had secreted a waterproof case containing a second phone, a USB drive, and most crucially a video. With trembling fingers, Margaret connected the USB drive to her phone. The video that began to play showed Sarah, clearly recording herself in secret, documenting a meeting between Victor Reed, Steve Mason, and several men whose faces made both Williams' parents gasp in recognition. "That's Mayor Thompson's brother," Robert whispered. "And that's, oh God, that's Judge Hampton's son-in-law." The video showed more than just a meeting. It documented the arrival of a van, the unloading of terrified young women, the exchange of money. Sarah's voice provided quiet narration, dates, names, details that left no room for misinterpretation. It was damning evidence of human trafficking, recorded at great personal risk. The final segment showed Sarah speaking directly to the camera, her expression grim but determined. "If you're seeing this, something's happened to me. Everything is backed up to my secure email. The password is JamesAndrex2010. She paused, swallowing hard. "Alex, if it's you watching this, I'm sorry I couldn't tell you everything. I needed to protect you. I love you." The video ended, leaving Margaret and Robert in stunned silence. Only Caesar seemed energized, pacing the small space as if aware of the urgency that now drove them all. "We need to get this to the state police immediately," Robert said finally. "And we need to make copies insurance." Margaret nodded, already forwarding the video to her own email, to Foster's, to news outlets. 21 hours, she said, checking her watch. "That's all we have to save an innocent man." Back at the prison, Alex Morgan sat in his cell, staring at the wall where he'd scratched a crude countdown. The hours were disappearing, his life ticking away with each passing minute. He had no way of knowing about Harris's flight, about the video, about the state police now converging on Pinewood from multiple directions. All he knew was that somewhere out there Caesar was still fighting for him. And somehow that was enough to face whatever came next. The emergency hearing room of the state Supreme Court buzzed with tension as Justice Eleanor Ramirez reviewed the evidence before her. Outside, a media frenzy had descended on the previously quiet judicial building, with reporters speculating wildly about last-minute evidence in the Morgan case. James Foster sat with perfect stillness, his weathered hands clasped on the table before him, while Victoria Palmer fidgeted with her pen, her earlier confidence evaporated. "Let me be clear about what we have here," Justice Ramirez said, her voice cutting through the hushed room. "A notebook of questionable provenance, a video that could have been recorded at any time for any purpose, a detective who fled when questioned, and the word of a convicted murderer, all presented less than 18 hours before a scheduled execution." She removed her reading glasses, fixing Foster with a penetrating stare. "Is that an accurate summary, Mr. Foster?" Foster nodded, then added with one correction, Your Honor. "We also have Sarah Williams's secured email account, which contains dated, stamped evidence corroborating everything in the notebook and video. The State Attorney General's cyber forensics team has verified its authenticity within the last hour." Justice Ramirez turned to Palmer. "MS. Palmer, the state's position?" Palmer hesitated, her professional ambition warring with her ethical obligations. "The state acknowledges that significant new evidence has emerged that may bear on the defendant's guilt or innocence. In the interest of justice, we do not oppose a temporary stay of execution pending review." A murmur ran through the small audience of court officials and legal observers. Palmer's concession was tantamount to admitting the prosecution had rushed to judgment. Justice Ramirez made a note, then nodded decisively. "I am issuing an immediate stay of execution for Alexander Morgan. The evidence will be reviewed by a special panel, and a determination will be made regarding the need for a new trial." She fixed both attorneys with a stern gaze. Justice delayed is justice denied, but justice rushed is no justice at all. As the hearing adjourned, Foster sagged in momentary relief. They had bought time precious days or weeks to fully unravel the conspiracy and clear Alex's name. But as he gathered his materials, a court officer approached with a message that turned his blood cold. Detective Harris was found 20 minutes ago. Single gunshot wound to the head. The envelope is missing. The death that should have been prevented had simply found another target. At Pinewood Veterinary Clinic, Caesar's condition took a sudden, devastating turn. The bullet that had grazed his flank had done more damage than initially assessed internal bleeding that had gone undetected until the dog collapsed while drinking water. The veterinarian, Dr. Elena Ramirez, worked frantically to stabilize him, aided by both Margaret and Robert Williams, who refused to leave the animal's side. The bullet nicked an artery, Dr. Ramirez explained as she prepared for emergency surgery. It was a small tear, easily missed on initial examination. The exertion of the past 24 hours likely expanded the tear. Margaret stroked Caesar's head as the sedatives took effect, tears streaming down her face. "You did it, boy," she whispered. "You saved him. Now let us save you." Robert stood nearby, his own eyes suspiciously bright. The man who had spent months consumed by hatred for Alex Morgan now found himself praying for the life of Morgan's dog, the animal that had revealed the truth about their daughter's death. The irony wasn't lost on him, nor was the shame of how thoroughly he had embraced a narrative that had nearly sent an innocent man to his death. As Caesar was wheeled into surgery, Robert turned to his ex-wife. "I need to see Morgan," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I need to tell him about Sarah's video, about all of it. I need to." To apologize, Margaret finished for him. She nodded, understanding. "Go, I'll stay with Caesar." The drive to the prison was silent, Robert struggling to compose what he would say to the man he had so publicly vilified. How did one apologize for demanding another's execution? What words could possibly bridge such a chasm? At Pinewood County Detention Center, Alex Morgan was being processed for transfer back to the general population, the stay of execution having nullified his death row status. He sat in a holding cell, still trying to absorb Foster's hurried explanation of the evidence Caesar had helped uncover of Harris's flight and death, of the web of corruption that had nearly cost him his life. "Caesar?" he had asked immediately. "Is he all right?" Foster's hesitation had told him everything. "He was injured helping find the evidence. He's in surgery now. Margaret Williams is with him." Now, as Alex waited for the transfer paperwork to be completed, a guard appeared at his cell. "Morgan, you have a visitor." The man who entered was barely recognizable as Robert Williams. Gone was the righteous fury, the rigid posture of moral certainty. In its place was a broken man, aged beyond his years, shoulders stooped with the weight of terrible understanding. "Mr. Morgan," he began, then faltered. He took a deep breath and tried again. "Alex, I don't know how to begin." Alex gestured to the bench beside him. "Sit down, Mr. Williams." Robert did so, his hands clasped so tightly the knuckles showed white. "I wanted you dead," he said bluntly. "I convinced myself you'd killed my daughter, that you deserved to suffer as she had suffered. I wouldn't listen to Margaret, wouldn't consider any other possibility." He looked up, meeting Alex's gaze directly. "I was wrong." The simplicity of the statement hung between them. Alex saw the anguish in the older man's eyes, the desperate need for what? Forgiveness? Understanding? Absolution? "You were a father who lost his daughter," Alex said finally. "Grief doesn't always leave room for reason." Robert shook his head. "Don't make excuses for me. I nearly sent an innocent man to his death because it was easier than facing the truth that Sarah put herself in danger, just like her brother did, and that I couldn't protect either of them." His voice broke on the last words, and suddenly he was weeping harsh sobs that seemed torn from deep within. Alex hesitated, then placed a hand on Robert's shoulder. He had harbored anger toward this man, certainly, but faced with such raw pain, the anger seemed trivial, unworthy. "Sarah was investigating something important," Alex said quietly. "Something that might save other young women from terrible fates. Like her brother, she believed some things were worth the risk." Robert nodded, struggling to regain composure. "I saw the video," he managed. "She mentioned you. Said she was trying to protect you, that she loved you." The words hit Alex like a physical blow. Sarah had loved him. Despite the secrets, despite the necessary deceptions of her work, what had been between them was real. The knowledge was both balm and knife, healing and wounding in equal measure. "Thank you for telling me that," Alex said, his own voice unsteady. They sat in silence for a moment, two men connected by love for the same woman, by grief at her loss, by the terrible machinery of injustice that had nearly claimed another victim. "Caesar is in surgery," Robert said finally. "The bullet wound was worse than they thought. Margaret is with him." He hesitated, then added, "That dog saved your life. And he helped me find my way back to something like humanity. I don't know if he'll make it, but I thought you should know what's happening." Alex closed his eyes, pain lancing through him at the thought of Caesar fighting for his life. The faithful companion who had stood by him through his darkest days, who had somehow understood what needed to be done when no one else could help. If Caesar died saving him, how could he bear it? "I need to be there," he said, opening his eyes with sudden determination. Robert nodded. "I've already spoken to the warden. Under the circumstances and with a state police escort, they've agreed to allow a brief compassionate visit. There's a car waiting." As they rose to leave, Robert hesitated once more. "I don't expect your forgiveness, Alex. What I tried to do, is unforgivable. But I want you to know that I'll spend whatever time I have left making this right. The people who killed Sarah will face justice. I swear it." Alex studied the man before him, broken but resolute, consumed by regret yet determined to forge a path toward redemption. He recognized the journey, had walked a similar road himself after James's death. "We'll make it right together," he said, and extended his hand. The corridor of Pinewood Veterinary Clinic seemed endless as Alex walked between two state police officers, Robert Williams a half-step behind. Though technically still in custody, the handcuffs had been removed, a small concession of humanity in the face of potential tragedy. Alex's heart hammered against his ribs, each step bringing him closer to Caesar, to the faithful companion who had accomplished what an entire legal system could not, but uncovering the truth. Outside the surgery room, Margaret Williams rose from her chair, eyes red-rimmed from crying. She had aged since Sarah's death, her once vibrant auburn hair now streaked with gray, but the quiet strength that had led her to question the official narrative remained undiminished. When she saw Alex, something in her expression softened further. "He's still in surgery," she said without preamble. "Dr. Ramirez is doing everything possible." Alex nodded, not trusting himself to speak. The officers guided him to a chair with a clear view of the surgery room's observation window. Through the glass, he could see medical personnel in scrubs working urgently over a still form on the table. Caesar, his brave, loyal Caesar, fighting one last battle. "How did this happen?" Alex asked, his voice barely audible. Margaret settled beside him, her shoulder almost touching his, a subtle gesture of solidarity. "Someone shot at us in the forest when we found Sarah's notebook. We thought it was just a graze, but..." She trailed off, unable to finish. He kept going, Robert supplied from where he stood against the opposite wall. "Even injured, he led us to the well house, to the video. He wouldn't rest until we understood." Alex pressed his palms against his eyes, fighting back tears. Caesar had always been like that, relentless in his duty, unflagging in his loyalty. When they'd worked cases together during Alex's police years, the German Shepherd had tracked suspects through blizzards, across rivers, once even through a burning building. Nothing deterred him when he had a mission. The waiting stretched into hours. Outside the clinic windows, dusk settled over Pinewood, streetlights flickering to life in the gentle snowfall. One of the state officers received a call and stepped away to answer it, returning with an update that rippled through their small group like an electric current. "They've arrested Judge Hampton," the officer reported quietly, "and Mayor Thompson. The state attorney general is personally overseeing the investigation. It's looking like at least a dozen officials were involved in the trafficking operation." Alex absorbed this without visible reaction. Justice for Sarah mattered, certainly, but in this moment his world had narrowed to the surgery room and its precious occupant. Caesar was all that mattered now. Shortly after 8 o'clock, Dr. Ramirez emerged, surgical mask pulled down around her neck, exhaustion evident in every line of her body. Alex stood immediately, reading her face for any clue to Caesar's condition. "He's stable," she said, and Alex felt his knees weaken with relief. The internal bleeding was extensive and he's not out of danger yet, but he's fighting. The next 24 hours will be critical. Can I see him? Alex asked. Dr. Ramirez glanced at the state officers who nodded their assent. Briefly, she conceded. He's heavily sedated, but some studies suggest animals can sense familiar presences even while unconscious. They followed her into a recovery room where Caesar lay on a padded table, an IV line running into his foreleg, monitoring equipment beeping steadily beside him. The proud, energetic German shepherd looked diminished somehow, his powerful body vulnerable beneath a blue medical blanket. A large shaved patch on his flank revealed the surgical site, neatly stitched and bandaged. Alex approached slowly, his hand trembling as he reached out to touch Caesar's head. The dog's fur felt the same as always, thick and slightly coarse, with the softer patch behind his ears that Alex had rubbed countless times during quiet evenings at home. Now he stroked it gently, leaning down to whisper in Caesar's ear. "You did it, boy. You saved me. Now you have to fight a little longer, okay? I need you to come home." For a moment, perhaps a trick of his desperate imagination, Alex thought he saw Caesar's ear twitch, a flicker of recognition. Then the moment passed, and the dog remained motionless except for the gentle rise and fall of his chest. When they returned to the waiting area, a new visitor had arrived. James Foster sat conversing quietly with Robert Williams, his briefcase open on the chair beside him. He stood when he saw Alex, holding out a document with an official seal. "It's done," Foster said simply. "Full exoneration. The state attorney general expedited it personally. You're a free man, Alex." Alex took the paper, scanning the formal language that officially acknowledged his innocence and dismissed all charges. Under normal circumstances, this moment would have been triumphant, the culmination of a nightmare finally ended, justice restored. Instead, it felt hollow, a technicality overshadowed by Caesar's struggle. "There's more," Foster continued, sensing Alex's subdued reaction. They found Victor Reed and Steve Mason hiding at a hunting lodge near the state line. Both in custody, both talking to save themselves. The whole operation is unraveling hour by hour. This did penetrate Alex's preoccupation. Sarah's killers captured the men who had murdered her when she discovered their trafficking operation, who had deliberately framed him to divert suspicion. A cold satisfaction settled in his chest. "I want to be there," he said. "When they're arraigned, I want to see their faces." Foster nodded, understanding. "It's being fast-tracked. Day after tomorrow." He hesitated, then added, "There's something else you should know. Detective Harris didn't commit suicide." This caught everyone's attention. Margaret moved closer, Robert straightened from his slump position, and even the state officers seemed more alert. The state police forensics team found gunshot residue patterns inconsistent with self-infliction, Foster explained, and the angle of entry couldn't have been self-administered. Someone made it look like suicide, but Harris was murdered almost certainly to prevent him from testifying. "My God," Margaret whispered. "How deep does this go?" "That's what the Attorney General intends to find out," Foster replied grimly. This wasn't just a local trafficking operation. The financial records in Sarah's email point to connections across state lines, possibly even international involvement. What your daughter uncovered may be the tip of a very large, very dangerous iceberg. Alex thought of Sarah, her determination, her courage, her willingness to risk everything for justice. She had died trying to expose monsters who trafficked in human misery, who treated young women as commodities to be bought and sold. And now, because of her meticulous documentation and Caesar's unwavering loyalty, those same monsters would face judgment. Sarah would be satisfied, he said quietly. Not happy she wasn't naive about the system, but satisfied that the truth came to light. Margaret nodded, tears welling in her eyes. She always said that truth was the only foundation worth building on, even when it hurt, even when it cost dearly. Dr. Ramirez reappeared, clipboard in hand. "Mr. Morgan, I've arranged for Caesar to be monitored continuously through the night. There's a cot in the staff lounge if you'd like to stay nearby." She glanced at the state officers. "I assume that's permissible now?" The senior officer nodded. Mr. Morgan is no longer in state custody. He's free to go wherever he chooses. Freedom, a concept that had seemed increasingly abstract during Alex's months of incarceration, now stretched before him like an unfamiliar landscape. He could walk out the door, return to his cabin, try to rebuild what remained of his life. But the choice was no choice at all. "I'll stay with Caesar," he said simply. As the night deepened, the clinic emptied of all but essential personnel. Foster departed with promises to return in the morning with further updates on the investigation. Robert and Margaret Williams left together, their shared concern for Caesar having forged a temporary bridge across years of bitterness. The state officers, their protective duty ended with Alex's exoneration, wished him well before heading back to join the expanding investigation. Alone in the dimly lit staff lounge, Alex stretched out on the narrow cot but found sleep elusive. Every few minutes he rose to check on Caesar through the recovery room's observation window. The German Shepherd remained motionless, the machines monitoring his vital signs beeping with reassuring regularity. Around 3 in the morning, as Alex dozed fitfully, a sharp bark jerked him awake. He rushed to Caesar's room to find Dr. Ramirez already there, checking the dog's vital signs with brisk efficiency. "What happened?" Alex demanded, heart pounding. "I heard him bark." Dr. Ramirez shook her head, puzzled. "He's still heavily sedated, Mr. Morgan. It's not possible for him to have barked." Yet as they both watched, Caesar's legs twitched, his paws moving as if running in a dream. A soft whine escaped his throat, not quite a bark, but undeniably vocalization. Then his eyes opened, unfocused but aware, searching the room until they found Alex. The tail that had helped express Caesar's every emotion throughout their years together gave a single weak thump against the table. "That's unexpected," Dr. Ramirez admitted, checking the monitors again. "His vital signs are actually improving. Sometimes I think these animals have resources we can't possibly understand." Alex moved to Caesar's side, placing his hand on the dog's head. "Hey, boy," he whispered. "I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." Caesar's eyes closed again, but his breathing seemed deeper, more purposeful. Even to Alex's untrained observation, the dog appeared to be fighting his way back with the same determination that had characterized his search for Sarah's evidence. By dawn, Dr. Ramirez confirmed what Alex already sensed: Caesar had turned a corner. The internal bleeding had stopped, his vital signs were stabilizing, and he was showing signs of increased responsiveness. He wasn't out of danger, but the prognosis had shifted from guarded to cautiously optimistic. As morning light filtered through the clinic windows, Margaret and Robert Williams returned, bearing coffee and breakfast sandwiches from the diner across the street. The news about Caesar's improvement visibly relieved them both. "Stubborn dog," Robert commented, his gruff tone belied by the softness in his eyes. "Reminds me of his owner." The observation might once have carried barbed accusation, but now it felt almost like respect. Alex accepted it with a nod, too exhausted for anything more. They were eating in companionable silence when Foster burst through the clinic doors, his usual measured demeanor replaced by barely contained excitement. "You need to see this," he announced, brandishing the morning newspaper. The headline sprawled across the front page in bold type: "Corruption Exposed, Judge Mayer Among Dozen Arrested in Trafficking Ring." Beneath it was a photo of Judge Hampton being led from his home in handcuffs, flanked by state police officers. "It's breaking nationally," Foster continued, pulling out his phone to show them news alerts from major networks. "The state attorney general held a press conference an hour ago. He specifically credited Sarah Williams as the courageous undercover operative who gathered the evidence, and—" Foster paused, looking directly at Alex. He mentioned Caesar by name, calling him the extraordinary dog who ensured justice was served. Alex took the phone, scanning the updates with growing astonishment. Caesar, the loyal companion so many had dismissed as merely a condemned man's pet, was being hailed as a hero. The story of how he had led Margaret to Sarah's hidden evidence captured the public imagination, transforming overnight from a local curiosity to a national sensation. "There's more," Foster continued. "The governor is issuing a formal apology for the rush to judgment in your case. And there's talk of a special commendation for Caesar." It was almost too much to absorb. Just 48 hours earlier, Alex had been counting down the final hours of his life in a death row cell. Now he stood exonerated, his name cleared, while the true criminals faced justice. All because of a German shepherd who refused to give up. As if summoned by their discussion, Dr. Ramirez appeared in the doorway. "Mr. Morgan, Caesar is awake and seems to be asking for you." He's quite insistent, actually. Alex hurried to the recovery room, the others following at a respectful distance. Inside, Caesar lay still bandaged and attached to monitoring equipment, but his head was raised, ears perked forward, eyes alert and focused. When he saw Alex, his tail thumped against the table with increasing strength, and a soft whine of greeting escaped his throat. "Hey, partner," Alex said, moving to the dog's side. Caesar strained upward, trying to reach Alex's face. Understanding, Alex carefully leaned down, allowing the dog to lick his cheek, their long-established ritual of reunion after separations. Dr. Ramirez watched with undisguised amazement. "I've been a veterinarian for 15 years, she said, "and I've never seen anything quite like this." His recovery rate is extraordinary, almost as if he's willing himself well. "He knows his job isn't finished," Alex said, understanding completely. Caesar had found the evidence, had cleared Alex's name, but the faithful dog wouldn't truly rest until he had seen the mission through to its conclusion, until they were home together, their partnership restored. As Alex stroked Caesar's head, the German shepherd's eyes held his with an intelligence that transcended species, the silent communication of two beings bound by mutual trust and unwavering loyalty. In that gaze, Alex read everything he needed to know. Caesar would recover. They would face whatever came next together, as they always had. And somehow, improbably, life would begin again. Spring arrived in Pinewood with gentle insistence, coaxing pale green buds from winter bare branches and scattering wildflowers across forest clearings. At Alex Morgan's cabin, daffodils lined the freshly painted porch, their bright yellow faces turned toward the afternoon sun. Caesar lounged on the steps, his coat gleaming with health as he surveyed his domain with contented vigilance. Though a faint scar remained on his flank, a permanent reminder of his brush with death, the German shepherd had made a remarkable recovery, defying Dr. Ramirez's most optimistic projections. Alex emerged from the cabin carrying 2 glasses of iced tea. He handed one to Margaret Williams, who sat in a rocking chair watching a chickadee flit among the newly leafed trees. At 60, Margaret had found unexpected renewal in the aftermath of tragedy, her silver-streaked hair now worn in a short practical cut, her posture more upright, her eyes clearer than they had been in years. "Robert called this morning," she said, "accepting the tea." "The governor signed the bill. It's official now." Alex nodded, settling into the adjacent rocker with a slight smile. The Sarah Williams Act. She would have been embarrassed by the attention. But proud of the substance, Margaret countered. Mandatory review of all capital cases, expanded resources for public defenders, stricter protocols for handling evidence. These were things she believed in. Alex couldn't argue with that. Sarah had possessed a fierce commitment to justice, not the expedient facsimile that had nearly cost him his life, but true justice, but with its attendant complexities and demands for vigilance. The legislation bearing her name wouldn't fix a flawed system overnight, but it represented meaningful progress. The 6 months since his exoneration had passed in a blur of testimonies, interviews, and gradual healing. Victor Reed and Steve Mason had been convicted on multiple counts, including Sarah's murder, and now awaited sentencing. Judge Hampton, facing federal charges and abandoned by his powerful connections, had accepted a plea deal in exchange for testimony against higher-level conspirators. The trafficking network Sarah had died exposing continued to unravel, its tentacles reaching into surprising corners of wealth and influence. For Alex, justice had brought not the closure he'd expected, but rather an opening, a reluctant return to engagement with a world he'd once rejected. The cabin that had been his fortress of solitude now regularly welcomed visitors. Margaret came each week with books and local gossip. Robert stopped by occasionally, still awkward but increasingly genuine in his efforts to make amends. Foster, having postponed retirement indefinitely, brought legal updates and chess challenges that stretched long into evening. "The memorial is finished," Margaret said, interrupting his thoughts. "They're unveiling it next weekend at the courthouse plaza. Robert and I walked by yesterday. It's quite beautiful." Alex had contributed to the memorial's design, but a simple granite slab engraved with Sarah's image and the names of the 23 women she had helped rescue through her undercover work. Beneath her likeness, a bronze German shepherd stood in watchful guardianship, Caesar immortalized in his prime, head high and alert. "We'll be there," Alex promised, glancing at Caesar, who lifted his head at some distant sound only he could detect. The dog's ears pricked forward, his posture suddenly alert. A moment later, the crunch of tires on gravel confirmed his early warning. A familiar truck appeared around the bend in the driveway. Robert Williams emerged, carrying a large paper bag that emitted promising aromas. Behind him came Dr. Ramirez, who had transitioned from Caesar's veterinarian to friend during the long weeks of recovery. She held a bakery box tied with string, Caesar's favorite dog treats, specially made by the baker's wife. "Hope we're not interrupting," Robert called as they approached. "Elena finished early at the clinic, and we thought we'd bring dinner." "Perfect timing," Margaret replied, rising to help with the food. Alex was just mentioning the memorial dedication. The ease between the once-divorced Williamses had surprised everyone, perhaps themselves most of all. Their shared grief, followed by their united purpose in clearing Alex's name, had forged an unexpected connection. Not reconciliation, exactly that would have suggested a return to something previous, but rather the careful construction of something new, built on hard-earned wisdom and mutual respect. As they settled around the picnic table Alex had built last month, Caesar positioned himself strategically at the juncture of most likely food spillage. The conversation flowed naturally. Dr. Ramirez's upcoming veterinary conference, Robert's volunteer work with the local literacy program, the ongoing transformation of Pinewood's governance in the wake of the corruption scandal. "I heard from Foster today," Alex mentioned as they finished eating. "The Justice Department is creating a special task force based on Sarah's investigative methodology. They're calling it the Williams Protocol." Margaret's eyes glistened with sudden tears. "She would have been 33 next month," she said softly. Robert reached across the table to cover her hand with his, a gesture of shared grief that required no words. The moment of sadness passed gently, as it increasingly did these days, acknowledged but not overwhelming, a shadow moving across the sun rather than permanent darkness. Alex had learned that grief, like healing, followed no predictable timeline. Some days the loss of Sarah felt as fresh as that first terrible moment when he'd heard of her death. Other days he could recall her laugh, her determination, her courage, with a bittersweet gratitude that she had been part of his life at all. As twilight settled over the clearing, they moved to the fire pit Alex had constructed near the edge of the property. Caesar circled 3 times before settling at Alex's feet, chin resting on his paws but eyes still vigilant. The flames cast dancing shadows across their faces as conversation dwindled into comfortable silence. "I've been thinking," Alex said finally, his voice quiet against the background chorus of spring peepers. "The cabin feels too isolated now. I'm considering moving back into town." The announcement didn't seem to surprise the others. Margaret nodded thoughtfully, and Robert asked the practical question, "Any properties in mind?" "There's a house on Maple Street," Alex replied. "Walking distance to the park, fenced yard for Caesar. Needs some work, but nothing I can't handle." What he didn't say, what didn't need saying, was that isolation no longer offered the protection he'd once sought. The walls he'd built against the world had been breached, not by force but by necessity, by Caesar's determination, and by the unexpected kindness of people who had once wished him harm. The cabin represented a retreat from life. The house on Maple Street would be a step toward it. "The neighborhood kids will love Caesar," Dr. Ramirez observed with a smile. "He's already something of a celebrity. The children at the clinic still ask about him." Caesar's ears twitched at his name, and he lifted his head as if aware he was the topic of conversation. The German shepherd's fame had spread far beyond Pinewood in the months since Alex's exoneration. A children's book about his heroic evidence gathering was in publication, and a documentary crew had spent weeks filming his recovery and daily routine. Caesar had accepted the attention with characteristic dignity, tolerating the cameras and microphones as long as they didn't interfere with his primary mission, keeping Alex safe. As darkness deepened, Robert and Dr. Ramirez departed first, followed by Margaret with promises to help pack whenever Alex was ready to move. Left alone with Caesar, Alex remained by the dying fire, watching sparks rise toward the star-scattered sky. The German shepherd shifted closer, resting his head on Alex's knee in silent companionship. "What do you think, boy?" Alex asked softly. "Ready for a new chapter?" Caesar's eyes reflected the ember's glow as he gazed up at his human. In that steady regard, Alex read what he needed to know, that home wasn't this cabin or the house on Maple Street or any physical location. Home was wherever they faced the future together. 1 year to the day after his scheduled execution, Alex Morgan stood on the courthouse steps beside Caesar, who sat at perfect attention despite the excitement of the crowd gathered for the memorial dedication. The bronze likeness of the German shepherd gleamed in the spring sunlight, a permanent testament to extraordinary loyalty. Sarah's image, captured in granite with remarkable fidelity, seemed to gaze beyond the present moment toward a horizon of possibility. As the mayor newly elected following the scandal concluded his remarks, he invited Alex to the podium. Caesar rose in perfect synchronization, accompanying his human as he had through darkness and light, through justice miscarried and finally served. Together they faced the assembled citizens of Pinewood, their journey from condemned to celebrated reflected in every respectful face. Alex hadn't prepared formal remarks. Instead, he simply placed his hand on Caesar's head and spoke from the heart. Sarah Williams believed that truth would prevail, even when the path to it seemed impossible to find. Caesar showed us that loyalty and love can illuminate that path even in our darkest hour. He paused, looking down at the German shepherd who had saved not just his life but his faith in possibility. This memorial honors Sarah's courage and Caesar's devotion. May it remind us all that justice requires vigilance, that truth demands pursuit, and that sometimes our most profound teachers have 4 paws and ask nothing in return except our trust. Caesar, sensing the completion of their mission, pressed against Alex's leg in quiet solidarity. Together they descended the steps into spring sunshine, but into a future neither could have imagined, in that death row cell, a future built on tragedy but sustained by something Caesar had understood all along, that even in a broken world, love persists, truth matters, and second chances await those brave enough to pursue them. In the twilight of life, we often reflect on what truly matters. The judge sentenced the man to death reminds us that loyalty transcends all boundaries, even when justice fails, when systems crumble, when hope seems lost. Like Caesar, the German shepherd who refused to abandon his master, we too must stand firm for those we love. As we age, we've witnessed both the beauty and brokenness of our world. This story speaks to something we've always known, that sometimes the purest wisdom comes not from courts or authority, but from the unwavering heart of a faithful companion. The bond between Alex and Caesar mirrors the connections we cherish most, those that sustain us through our darkest hours, that believe in us when no one else will. In a world that increasingly values expediency over truth, remember that loyalty, persistence, and love are never outdated. Like Caesar, may we continue to fight for what's right, to stand by those who need us, and to believe that even in our winter years, we still have the power to illuminate the path to justice for others. I hope you enjoyed today's story. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Leave a like and comment below what you thought of the story. See you in the next video.